Okay, everybody, welcome to this episode of the show. As ever, I'm delighted to be joined by my friend and colleague and in-house analyst here at the Miriam Institute, Yaakov Lappin. Yaakov, it's great to have you with me. I hope that you're keeping well, and I want to dive directly into some of the headlines for our listeners. And the first topic that I would like to hit, Yaakov, is the storm that is swirling around President Donald Trump's repeated suggestion that the resolution to the displaced Gazans inside the Gaza Strip may lay in the territories of Egypt and in the territories of Jordan. President Trump has alluded to the idea that the Gaza Strip, pretty much in its entirety, is essentially a demolition site, to use his turn of phrase. He's expressed that, in his words, it ought to be cleaned out and that there may be an opportunity to have the Gazans relocated to the areas of Egypt and to the areas of Jordan. Specifically, he's spoken about those two countries. Of course, everybody knows that the Sinai Peninsula abuts the Gaza Strip. It's a piece of contiguous land. Sinai Peninsula obviously is sovereign territory for Egypt. And Jordan, of course, is not connected to the Gaza Strip, but obviously is the country that is astride the River Jordan to the east of the state of Israel. So I just want to begin by asking you what you think about that idea and its viability, and then obviously I'll come back at you.
Sure. So this is something that we've been discussing both on camera and off camera for a long time, and I know that you have some very original and long-standing thoughts about this. What I zoom in on is less what I think should happen or what I want to happen, and I'm looking at what I think is the most likely response to this call by President Trump. And in my view, the leaders of Egypt and the leaders of Jordan, King Abdullah of Jordan, President Sisi of Egypt, they will view this call as kryptonite. They will view it as an existential threat to the stability of their rule. And the reason for that is very simple. It's because both of these leaders have an array of Islamist challengers to the throne. And what these Islamists do is they, day in and day out, call them collaborators. They call them collaborators of Israel, collaborators of the United States, collaborators with infidels, with the West, etc., etc. Their legitimacy is under fire constantly by Islamists and by jihadists, and it's part of a wider civil war that's been raging in the Islamic world. Now, again, I'm not expressing an opinion. What should happen, I'm not saying what I think about these leaders. We can perhaps get to that later if we'll have time. I'm just sharing what I observe to be happening in the Arab and Muslim world and in these two countries. Now, in that climate, because they are already nervous about their legitimacy, nervous about being overthrown, and, we have examples of Arab leaders to overthrow, no shortage of examples. Some end up in jail, some end up being killed. They are terrified of that happening to them. So they believe, in my view, what they think is that if they answer this call, never mind what they think about it, if they answer this call, take in large numbers of Gazans, that will be a death blow to their legitimacy. And the Islamists will say, here you go. Here are the collaborators of Israel. They're taking part in quote unquote ethnic cleansing. We need to have a revolution. We need to overthrow these puppets. And then if that happens, if that scenario actually occurs, no amount of money, no amount of debt relief, whatever Trump wants to promise them will be any good to them because they'll be deposed. So because of those dynamics, I believe they will never agree to this call. I'm not saying what will happen. I have no idea what the future will hold. I'm just looking at it from, let's say, a realist perspective, the dynamics and the likely reaction. That's pretty much it.
Okay, so I'd like you to think about it through a different lens. The rule of Sisi and the rule of Abdullah in Egypt and Jordan, respectively, is obviously very, very tenuous. It's far from a secure rule. Your response, your reaction to this, the reasons that you've highlighted as to why this is unlikely to be greeted with enthusiasm by either of those two gentlemen, speaks to that vulnerability. The reason that these two remain in situ is because they are propped up in no small part by the United States and indeed by the State of Israel in both cases, incidentally. I'll give you some minor examples. We know that ISIS, for many, many years, while being decimated in the areas of Iraq and in Syria, it has not been decimated in the area of the Sinai Peninsula. The State of Israel has been permitted pretty regularly to fly sorties over the Sinai Peninsula in order to take care of the threat of ISIS in that area, in part because the terms of the ceasefire agreement, the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, rules that the Egyptians are only allowed to bring a certain amount of ordnance into the area of the Sinai Peninsula. And so given that limitation, Israel has taken care of that threat with some degree of regularity. So both Israel and the United States of America are in no small part responsible for the sustainability of Sisi's regime inside Egypt. Now, Egypt also receives not only military aid from the United States of America, but unlike the State of Israel, it receives economic aid from the United States of America. And it's that economic aid that enables it to placate a youthful, young, very restive population within its borders, which, if not placated, is very, very likely to bring about the downfall that you just described Sisi as fearing. And with regard to Egypt, I actually believe that the inducement of Sisi to accept Gazans could be brought about by way of increasing the military aid that Sisi receives, by way of increasing the economic aid that Sisi receives, by giving Sisi center stage within the Arab world, something that he's ceded in recent years, that Egypt has ceded in recent years to the Saudis and to the Emiratis to some degree, to bringing Egypt back to its historic place, center stage within the Arab world. And I think that the threat, the notion that that economic aid, that military aid would be withdrawn were Sisi not to help President Trump to bring about an outcome that he is speaking in terms of it being in the national interests of the United States of America, were Sisi to be obdurate and to be recalcitrant when asked to do that, were there a threat that those aid packages were to be withdrawn, I actually think that you could see Sisi go for such a plan. I don't think that it's beyond the realm of possibility. And I, for one, would very much like to see that plan advance. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. With regard to Jordan, I do not want to see what President Trump has suggested come about. Because unlike in the Sinai Peninsula, where the Gazans would not necessarily be proximate to us, where the Sinai Peninsula is surrounded by the ocean, by southern Israel, about southern Israel, and also mainland Egypt, if I can put it in those terms, the Kingdom of Jordan is one that teeters on the abyss on any given day, in my estimations. And were we to see the Gazans foment unrest inside Jordan, I think that essentially we would see the opening up of an eastern front that Israel would have to deal with that runs from Jordan over to Iraq and Iran. And so I very much oppose the notion of the Gazans being moved into that area. I also believe that the Gazans would certainly infiltrate areas of Judea and Samaria and foment even greater unrest in the area of Judea and Samaria, build up the presence, the strength, and the potency of Hamas, and therefore bring about a far more dangerous reality for Israel than is currently the case. And it is not an arena that lacks challenge on a security front as we speak today. So what I wonder is, to your response, why do you give so much credence to the notion that the Egyptians saying no is sufficient to block such a plan? Why should they be able to say no when they are the beneficiaries of so much military, so much economic aid, and particularly when they are in no small part responsible for the origins of the massacre on October the 7th? They allowed the porous border between Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula to act essentially as a revolving door for Gazans to go out of the Gaza Strip into Sinai, up to Lebanon, into Syria, over to Iraq, into Iran, receive training, contraband, and weaponry along that journey, and then return, reverse the route, go back through that same porous border of the Sinai Peninsula into the Gaza Strip, and then ultimately launch the horrors of October the 7th. Why should the Egyptians not accept these people that they were so willing to assist in their murderous plans, whether openly or quietly? Why should they not be induced to accept responsibility for what they, to some great degree, I would say, brought about?
So I don't think that the Egyptians actively assisted Hamas from the leadership level. I think that at the local border level, there was a lot of corruption, and that is the primary factor that enabled that smuggling. And there was, at the same time, there was a lot of tunnels that were blocked off by Sisi. So it was a very mixed bag. Clearly, the Egyptians failed to secure the border. Of that, there's no question and there's no debate. But I don't think it was a top-down order to fail. I think it was a reflection of the actual abilities of the Egyptian state, which is just shot through corruption, and including the Egyptian security forces and some of the companies that are involved there in the trafficking of Gaza. So I think it's a complicated problem, but at the end of the day, I agree that Egypt failed. Now, look, I think that we're having two separate conversations. One is about what should happen, and one is about what I happen to think will happen. And I'm not saying that Gazans won't move into Sinai at any point in the future. What I'm saying is that Sisi will say no. He will say no to the plan. And the reason he will say no, in addition to what I've said about the legitimacy, existential threat, the kryptonite that he sees this as being, is also what you've alluded to. You cannot separate Gazans from Hamas. They're intertwined. So by letting large numbers of Gazans into Egypt, what actually is happening, if that happens, is allowing Sisi's worst enemy, which is the Muslim Brotherhood, it would get a massive infusion of new blood, because the Muslim Brotherhood, their branch in Gaza is called Hamas. And, Sisi has jailed these people. He's hounded these people because they obviously want to overthrow him, just like in the past. They had Morsi. There's a constant power struggle between the non-Islamists in Egypt, led by the defense establishment there, and Sisi's very much part of that. He grew up in that system. And the Islamists, they are in a civil conflict over Egypt and who is going to run that country. Now, I think, first of all, it's in Israel's interest that Sisi wins that conflict, in my opinion, because I think in the Middle East, I have to choose from a menu. I can't decide what's on the menu when I'm talking about a country as big as Egypt. I'm not talking about right now Gaza. That's a different story. I think we have a lot more influence there. But Egypt, I have to choose from two main options. I'm going to choose Sisi over the Muslim Brotherhood. Second of all, if large numbers of Gazans move into Sinai, Hamas is moving with them. So in addition to the legitimacy threat from home, this is also going to turn into a security threat. Now, the other problem is this.
A security threat to whom?
To the stability of Egypt, because the Hamas elements that move in with the Palestinians will link up with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and you could have a surge of instability and challenge to Sisi's rule. And then, in that kind of scenario, again, no amount of money is going to help if he's overthrown. Now, the last thing I will say is that, the Arab countries, I think they have a sense of history. And when they look back at the 20th century, when they look at what happens when they let Palestinians, PLO, various Palestinian entities into their countries, it's almost always ended in disaster. So you have Lebanon, which descended into civil war when the PLO moved in and set off a chain reaction. And obviously there were also lots of reasons for that. But the presence of the PLO in Lebanon really helped destabilize that country and plunge it into chaos. And King Hussein, Abdullah's father, when he saw what was going on before what happened in Lebanon, the way that the PLO had turned Jordan into a terrorist base, and you've alluded to this, he threw them out. There was a little war, Black September 1970, and he threw the PLO out, and they moved into Lebanon. So these Arab leaders don't want the Palestinians in their borders at any cost. They view it as an existential threat, domestically, legitimacy, etc. And that's why I think they're going to say no. Now, if you're asking why should we accept that no, well, that's a separate question. That is a separate question. I personally don't object to the idea of having the call out there. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, you have millions of Ukrainians who have been absorbed by their neighbors, and you've made that argument yourself as well. So why not normalize it here? But I do object, or I would be against Egypt falling to the Muslim Brotherhood. If that scenario began to happen, I would not want that to happen. I would want to press stop because I think it's in our security interest to have Sisi in power rather than the Muslim Brotherhood. Those are the only two options, in my opinion, that are relevant for Egypt today.
Well, I think that I don't think that the Egyptians necessarily did. I think that the Egyptians absolutely facilitated what took place. I think that it was facilitated as a result of complete indifference at the very least, perhaps malicious intent at the very worst. And I think that to your point that about the typical international norms in a situation of a displaced population, I think that the Egyptians should have to play ball. And I want to speak it out. In other arenas, other parts of the world, when you have the mass displacement of a population, the international community implores and then it applauds a sort of two-step dance. It implores neighboring countries to absorb the displaced and also non-neighboring countries to absorb the displaced. So an example of that, and you just mentioned it, would be Ukraine. Ukrainians were absorbed by Poland. They were also incidentally absorbed by Israel. Another example of that would be Syria during the Syrian civil war. Syrians were absorbed by Turkey, a neighboring country. They were also absorbed, and Germany may rue the day that they did this, by Germany to the tune of about 1 million Syrian refugees, if I remember correctly. Now, here you have the exact inversion of that international law norm, and it should not stand. It should not be allowed to stand. Here we are told that anybody who absorbs the displaced Gazans, who incidentally, in my opinion, are displaced as a consequence of the leadership that they elected, the leadership that they support, and the leadership that recruits from among their number. I want to be very, very clear about my view with regard to the Gazan population. That Gazan population, we are told, uniquely, unlike the Ukrainians, unlike the Syrians, unlike refugees, displaced persons who become displaced persons because of all sorts of very, very different considerations and events, that those Gazans uniquely do not want to move anywhere. They want to revel in their suffering and remain in their suffering. I don't believe that that's the case. The entire Middle East is on the move. If you don't believe me, just go and take a walk through the streets of central London or northern England, or frankly, any other European country or capital, and you will see that the Middle East is on the move. I think that in addition to that, the idea that anybody who is even considering absorbing the Gazans should be labeled as complicit in the practice of ethnic cleansing speaks to another complete double standard. In any other arena, those who absorb the displaced are applauded for absorbing the displaced. Only in this situation do we have the ridiculous scenario where, were Egypt to open its borders in an act of benevolence toward the Gazan people, Egypt would somehow be participating in the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. So I think that the norms that exist in other parts of the world should be overlaid onto the map between Israel, Gaza, and Egypt. I think that it's very, very important that the call is out there. And I don't think that Sisi should be allowed to simply say, no, it doesn't suit me, it's dangerous for me. He should be made to say, okay, I'm going to accept them, but here's what I want in return. I want this increase in military aid. I want this increase in economic aid, and I want security guarantees. Because I actually think that in the event that there becomes a belligerent entity of Palestinian Gazans in the Sinai Peninsula, Israel is far more capable of defending itself against that threat than the belligerent Gazan population that currently clearly still exists inside the Gaza Strip. It's too proximate to the state of Israel. It has its mind, its soul turned against the very existence of the state of Israel, and it needs to be kept far, far away from anything proximate proximate to Israel's citizens and Israel's civilians. And I want to take the listeners on a very brief story, which I'm going to tell in a abridged form. I believe that there is real interest within this administration for this to get done. Whether or not it will be done, I don't know. I'm not a prophet, but I am able to look back on some very, very personal, direct experiences. In 2016, when Donald Trump was the candidate for the nomination for the presidency, I was called in to a meeting at Trump Tower by a lead member of Donald Trump's Middle East team. And in that meeting, around a conference table, one of the soon-to-become lead negotiators for the Israel-Palestinian conflict, he became a negotiator in what was the Trump administration once Donald Trump won his first election to the presidency. That negotiator, would-be negotiator, said to me, quote, "The candidate," referring to Donald Trump, "is not a supporter of the two-state solution. Is there an alternative to the two-state solution?" And I immediately presented to that individual, in the presence of witnesses, a plan that I had been speaking about throughout my lectures on college campuses when I was asked about the two-state solution, which I virulently and have always opposed. And I realized during my lectures on college campuses I couldn't just be the party of no. I had to put forward a different plan, and I started to speak about what I called the new state solution, which called for the establishment of a state for the Palestinian Arabs in the Gaza Strip with contiguity into about 10% of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, within that plan, and people can go and look at this online, I wrote an op-ed about it back just after the meeting that I had with the negotiator in Trump Tower. Within that plan, I said that the next massive attack launched by Hamas onto the people of Israel should serve as the prelude for the complete destruction of Hamas as a terrorist organization, and that fighting should be defined as being fought for the implementation of the new state solution, it being the political outcome that international negotiators will always say is absent the fighting, and therefore the fighting can't be converted into a positive long-term policy outcome, as we're seeing said about Israel's war inside the Gaza Strip right now, as we've heard about Syria during the course of the Syrian civil war, and we continue to hear until this very day. Now, I would actually make an adjustment to that plan. I would actually have the entirety of this entity, whatever one wants to call it, inside the Sinai Peninsula. And I actually am supportive of Donald Trump's idea of saying, let us look at the Gaza Strip, let us think about what we're going to do there, because it is such an area of disaster that we can't actually reasonably look at it and say the most appropriate thing is to clear all the rubble and the destruction and then build it up again. Far more simple to build up somewhere anew. And I'm telling you, Yaakov, from as you know, having served there, as I have done, the degree of distraction renders it impossible for anyone to convince me that it is most sensible to first clear that area and then rebuild that area. I truly believe it is far more sensible and far more viable to build something anew somewhere else. And I believe that that ought to be the Sinai Peninsula.
Well, I think, first of all, the listeners have gotten a very good peek into both of our perspectives. I still think we're kind of having two separate conversations, and it's very interesting to hear you lay out your vision and the adjustment that you've made to it, because, and you've used this word a few times while explaining your vision, it's based on the word what you think should happen, and I understand that you also think there's a reasonable chance that it will happen. It's not just what you think should happen. It's not.
Well, I think there's a reasonable chance that it could happen. As I said, I don't want to go into the predictions business, but I do want to emphasize, I believe that Donald Trump is serious when he puts this forward. I don't believe that he's speaking on a whim. I don't think he's shooting from the hip. Whether or not it will be implemented, we'll wait and see. But I think that it could be implemented. Yes,
right.
I do.
Right. Now, I personally think that the most likely scenario is that the Gazans are going to live in tents and ruins for a very long time. I think that's the most likely scenario. And listen, time's going to tell. I agree with you that no one's going to rebuild Gaza anytime soon. It's not on the agenda. The money's not there. And the reason for that is because I think it's actually us. We haven't finished We haven't finished our war goals, first of all. The war goal, in my view, has got to be the destruction of Hamas's political regime and the remnants of its terror army, these cells. I think there's at least a year of fighting left before we can even talk about, some sort of multinational run autonomy. I don't know what the options are, but in the meantime, in my opinion, the most likely scenario is that the Gazan people are going to be living in tents and in ruins, and they're going to be dependent on hundreds of trucks bringing international aid for a very, very long time. And they're going to live with the result of the war that Hamas waged in their name, the holy war, genocidal jihadist war. And they're going to live with the terrible consequences of that war for a very, very long time. I think that's the most likely scenario. Time will tell, Benjamin. We will see what happens.
Okay. Well, I'll just say two last points on that. The
Sure.
first thing that I would say is that in 2017, I personally led a group of former defense establishment senior figures from Israel who I gathered together, who I spoke to and instructed and basically outlined the parameters of the new state solution for. And I brought them to brief members of the House, members of the Senate, and the negotiating team of the Trump administration in the national security compound, which is in the same grounds, which is obviously in the grounds of the White House. And the enthusiasm for the alternative to the two-state solution that they assigned to the new state solution was high. I believe that what was perturbing to them was any suggestion that Hamas could be displaced, removed as the governing power of the Gaza Strip. So with the change in that particular circumstance, I think that the enthusiasm for the presentation, the notion that the Gazans should be relocated in the Sinai Peninsula, I think that enthusiasm has grown. I think it's increased. And I actually think that in Israel, they are in greater need of some sort of resolution to the displacement of the Gazans than they currently have. And I actually would not be surprised at all if this becomes a central part of the conversation between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Donald Trump when Bibi travels to Washington, D.C. next week, because of what you've just described, Yaakov. Because, and this is my second point, having the Gazans living in tents is not a viable plan. I know that you're not presenting it as a viable plan, but I want everybody to understand that is not a viable plan. It's not a reasonable plan. And it leaves Hamas, in my opinion, to be able to fight another day in the very near future and to wreak further havoc on the people of Israel. And I am not convinced that when that day comes, we will necessarily have a friend in the White House, because I think that there are very real changes afoot, and nobody should be complacent about the idea that the leadership of the United States of America will forever stand by the state of Israel if and when Israel is forced to fight to defend itself. We've got a growing threat inside the Gaza Strip now. We need to do something about it that resolves it long term, and I actually think that this plan is a plan whose moment has come. But we will wait and see. I want to move on to the next topic, Yaakov, and that is the topic of the ceasefire. So security contractors have begun inspecting Gazans as they move from southern Gaza back to northern Gaza. And these inspections of the vehicles are actually undertaken in coordination by Egyptians, and the vehicle inspections themselves are undertaken by Americans, as I understand it. And the mechanism for that is a mechanism that's been brought about, of all things, by the Qatari Egyptian team responsible for the implementation of this plan. And I'm actually quite horrified by this. I don't view this as positive. As somebody who's served many, many months at a time on checkpoints, including particularly in the city of Hebron, I can tell you it just takes one decoy. It just takes one individual who is completely indifferent to what he sees in the trunk or under the hood of a Gazan car. It just takes one individual who is proactively sympathetic towards the Gazans that he is supposed to be inspecting, and you have all sorts of contraband making its way back to the areas that we are supposed to be preventing it from arriving at. I cannot understand how we've arrived at a situation where the checking of the Gazans moving north is now undertaken by this completely detached force of essentially hired guns, and why we're expected to place any semblance of reliability on that mechanism. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. U.S. mercenaries at checkpoints in Netzarim, looking at cars, are not the solution to anything, especially when the IDF is systematically and gradually leaving the area. And also, there are no checkpoints, as far as I understand, looking at all the pedestrians that are moving by foot. And these are large numbers. There are disputes about how many Gazans are moving around, but it's at least going to be 100, and if not double that, 1,000 people moving into northern Gaza. And that number is only going to increase, I think. Now, what happens when they get there is a separate question. But among those Palestinians, obviously, are Hamas members. This is how they operate. This is their modus operandi. It's embedding themselves in civilians at all levels, from buildings to schools to hospitals to masses of people, to displaced people. Nestled among them will be Hamas terrorists. And nobody, as far as I can tell, is checking the people moving on foot. And they could have all manner of weapons, rocket launchers, missile launchers, etc. So, look, this is bad. It's obviously bad. It's a very bad price. And what's happened here is that it seems that Netanyahu has said, look, I'm willing to give up on Netzarim corridor temporarily, but I'm not giving up on Philadelphia. Now, why has he agreed to that plan? My assumption is that he was told by the defense establishment, look, the IDF will temporarily withdraw to the perimeter. We talked about this, I think, last week. The security zone, it's about 1 kilometer deep, and it surrounds all of Gaza. It runs it down, straddles the entire Israeli-Gaza border. And so from a military perspective, Gaza remains completely surrounded by the IDF from south to east to north. And therefore, the call was made that this is a price that's worth paying in order to get as many live hostages out as possible. Now, this is definitely a U-turn on Netanyahu's part, because he used to say until not long ago that there will be no ceasefire that forces the IDF to leave Netzarim and Philadelphia. That has now changed to just maintaining a military presence on Philadelphia corridor. It's clearly given up on Netzarim. It's going to be a heavy price when the IDF moves back in, and I believe that this is an extremely likely scenario. The IDF is going to move back into northern Gaza once the fighting resumes. I think it's almost inevitable. And once that happens, there's going to be a different kind of warfare underway. There are two main scenarios. One is that the IDF will try once again to move those Gazans back to the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone. And the second is that it will not try to do that. It will simply fight as it knows how to do in a heavily populated urban area, which the IDF knows how to do. That's obviously a much more difficult way of fighting, because Hamas will have its human shields all around it. I don't know which of those scenarios will play out. There are a lot of unknowns, but I still believe that the most likely scenario is that phase 2 of this ceasefire will break down, will either not materialize or break down very quickly. And when that happens, I expect the IDF to move back into the fighting, and to this time fight for a very long time before once again redeploying.
Well, I think that we're in real danger here. I mean, I want people to understand where these Gazans are returning to. They are returning to areas that are just 700 meters from Kibbutz Nahal Oz. Nahal Oz is an area that, of course, was massacred on October the 7th. There was a kibbutz down the road from there with a similar name, Nir Oz, that was impacted to an even more sinister degree, a far more sinister degree, even than what Nahal Oz faced. But they are returning to a position of 700 meters. Think about that, folks. 700 meters from the perimeter of Kibbutz Nahal Oz. And your average individual can sprint that in a very, very short amount of time. And no mechanism of defense is hermetic. It's very, very troubling that they're being allowed to move so proximate towards our communities. And they're also moving to just 1.5 kilometers away from the southern city of Sderot. Sderot is of course, the city that is essentially synonymous with rocket bombardments from the Gaza Strip, has been for many, many years. But it's also the city where I saw for the first time on October the 7th, when I started to receive the social media posts about what was going on. It was in the town of Sderot that we saw the Toyota pickup trucks manned by these black-clad Hamas terrorists rampaging through the streets and shooting at everything and anything. And I am, quite frankly, sickened by the idea that the Gazans are allowed to move so closely. I'm sickened that they're allowed to move so closely after 400 soldiers have fought and died in the war that is still ongoing. It's still not a war that has come to the end. I don't believe that sacrifice and sacrifices such as those were made so that the enemy could move right back to the borders from which it was distanced. And I'm sickened by the fact that they're moving so proximate with such a lax system of checks. The notion that the checking is in the hands of Egyptians and American hired guns, to me, is completely perverse, utterly ridiculous. By the way, we don't see that going on in any other of our borders. We don't outsource security on our border between Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Jordan. We do have international forces there, but the IDF obviously is the primary party for ensuring the security of those borders. And the fact that we've been at war inside the Gaza Strip since, on the ground, November of 2023, only to hand that area over to the supervision of foreign forces with absolutely no skin in the game whatsoever, some of whom may be positively sympathetic to the Gazans. I'm referring to the Egyptians in this case, and of course to the Qataris who are involved in this mechanism, to me is preposterous beyond words. And I actually am very, very skeptical, Yaakov, and I'd like you to tell me why you are optimistic, or why you're inclined to believe that the war will ramp up again. I'm deeply, deeply skeptical about the idea that the fighting will resume with any degree of potency against the Gazans, now that you have so many hundreds of thousands of them moving from the south of the Strip to the north.
So, first of all, I agree with you about Qatar. I think that it's time for Israel to begin to systematically urge the United States, and for itself as well, to sideline and phase them out, because they really are a toxic, pro-Islamist, self-serving force that pretends to be a firefighter, but they themselves have started many of the flames that we're seeing. And I think that, I'm sure we've discussed Qatar in the past. It really is a wolf in a barely disguised sheep's clothing, which only the most naive, I think, will accept as a sheep. Now, look, regarding the Egyptians don't have control over who's moving into Israel from Egypt, because the IDF has not left Philadelphia corridor, and the IDF is surrounding the Rafah crossing. So anybody who comes out of that crossing is running straight into the IDF and the Shabak, the Shin Bet, Domestic Intelligence Agency, and they need to be screened they're screened individually.
Yaakov, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make my position clear on why I'm so alarmed by this. It's in this case, separate to our earlier subject, namely the presence of the Gazans in the Sinai Peninsula. In this case, I'm alarmed by the Gazans who are being allowed to move from inside the southern Gaza Strip, or Al-Mawasi, north towards areas such as Jabalia and Zaytun, and those areas that are very, very close indeed to Israel's community. So it's they that I'm referring to, if I wasn't clear.
Yeah, no, you were perfectly clear, but you added, in addition to that, something about the Egyptians. So I just wanted to clarify from my own understanding and conversations with officials. What official Israel is saying is, we haven't given up on anything when it comes to Philadelphia, the border with Egypt. Israel maintains full operational control. Just something to throw into the mix. I completely agree with your concerns about what's happening in northern Gaza. I think that the fighting is likely going to resume, and here's why. When you look at the official war goals, we have three, right? We know them very well by now. It's the destruction of Hamas's military capabilities, its political regime has to be destroyed, and releasing the hostages. Now, what we're seeing, I think, is the cabinet, for various reasons, which we'll probably go into another time, but it's maneuvering in between these objectives. Now, look, Hamas's military capabilities have been destroyed by more than 80%. Okay, if If you look at the number of Hamas killed, 20,000 operatives, the vast majority of their rocket arsenal, the majority of their tunnel infrastructure, the fact that they can, put uniforms and AK-47s into the hands of new recruits that have no training, who are still dangerous to the IDF in Gaza, but these are not, the Hamas battalions and brigades that we were facing a year and a half ago. Is Hamas trying to present itself as basically being something that it's not: strong, militarily capable. It's none of those things. It's a deeply, deeply wounded animal. And so, look, the cabinet made the decision that it's going to now go towards the goal of releasing as many live hostages as possible. But if it stops here, right? If it stops here and moves into some sort of long-term truce, the other two war goals will become a mockery. Hamas's political regime will surge right back, and it's going to start rebuilding its terror army. Now, it hasn't done that yet. It cannot do that so quickly. The time frames that we're looking at will not allow Hamas to rebuild a fully functioning terror army in the space of a month. It's just not possible. It's going to take them years. And so this is why I'm optimistic, because I believe if Israel moves back into the fighting in 3 to 4 weeks, 5 weeks max, then it will be able to meet the other two war goals. As long as it goes all the way this time, and by all the way in my book, that means establishing a military administration in the Gaza Strip, taking over the aid distribution, going street by street and destroying what's left of those cells. This is going to be very difficult counterterrorism operations. I think it would take at least a year. I think the Gazans, like I said, they're going to be in their tents. A lot of them will reach their ruins and they'll see that they have nothing there. And I think a lot of them will head back to Al-Mawasi anyway. They won't need the IDF to tell them, because they won't want to. I don't think they're going to want to stay in ruins, especially when the heat comes back in a couple of months. So I think that this is the future of Gaza. The future of Gaza is months and months and months of combat. And then I think, Israel is going to try and recruit its Gulf partners, the United States, to try and, figure out some sort of workable autonomy with very, very carefully selected Gazans, while Israel maintains security control of the entire strip. I'm not saying that the IDF is going to be there forever in all parts of the strip, but I think the raids are going to continue in the foreseeable future. I'm looking at, Judea and Samaria as a precedent here. I think that's where this is going. That's how I see it. Otherwise, it's basically a surrender of 2 out of the 3 war goals, and I don't think that Prime Minister Netanyahu intends to do that. From everything he's done until now, I do not believe he intends to surrender the 2 out of the 3 primary war goals. Benjamin, you're on mute.
Well, I don't think that he intended to allow the Gazans to move back north at this stage. I don't think that he intended to have Egyptians and Americans overseeing the checking of the vehicles that were moving north at this stage. I think that he, unfortunately, has been compelled to do a number of things that he did not intend to do. And I'm very concerned. I'm not going to say that I don't believe it's possible that the fighting will be ramped up again, but I think it's very, very doubtful, and it becomes ever more doubtful with every Gazan that does return to the northern area of the Gaza Strip. I think that you are going to see the Prime Minister implored, including by Israel's allies, to not start to move again the Gazan population that returns to those areas, as I said, of Jabalia, Zaytun, Gaza City, elsewhere. And I think that it's going to be very, very difficult to convince Israel that the sensible thing is to fight among masses of Gazans in those areas for the near and longer term, as you've just described. I think that's going to be tremendously, tremendously unpopular, specifically when we consider that the very ability of the IDF to effectively bring about the results that you've rightly described, namely the enfeebling of Hamas, required the mass movement of the Gazan population away from those areas so that that fierce fighting could be prosecuted in the most humane way possible with respect to the Gazan population as opposed to the terror fighters of Hamas. But time's going to tell. I'm not enthusiastic about the idea. I think that it's going to be a real, real heavy lift, very, very heavy lift, for Prime Minister Netanyahu to ramp up the fighting inside Gaza the way that once it was with the return of these Gazan civilians. I want
So
to now talk.
just before you move on to the
Yeah,
topic, I guess I'll take my turn now to say what I think should happen. If the IDF does not move back into Gaza, that I think will be, I don't want to use the word death blow, but it will be a mortal wound. Let's say, first of all, to Israel's south, as you've just said, Sderot, Nir
yeah.
Am, all these communities. Who is going to want to live there when Hamas is rebuilding its terror army?
Let me put you on the spot. Let me put you on the spot on that point and then make your other point. You're a
That was my
father.
point, basically. Yeah, that was
Well,
it.
you're a father. You've got three beautiful kids. I know your kids. Would you move there? Would you
I
move your kids to Sderot? Would you move your kids to Nahal Oz right now, given this phenomenon of hundreds of thousands of Gazans moving so very close to where your children would be sleeping at night?
If the IDF is on the other side of the border conducting security operations, I would feel a lot more secure. If the IDF is not in the territory, if it's not conducting day in and day out security operations at any level, I'm not going into whether it's a division or a brigade, but if it's not in the field, if the army is not in front of the civilian population where the army is supposed to be, and if it's gone back to this backwards order that we used to talk about, you really pointed this out, I remember, that the army should not be behind civilians. It's supposed to be in front of civilians,
No,
right?
it's ridiculous. Yeah,
In front of the, if that old October 6th logic comes back, I wouldn't dream of living there. If the correct order comes back, then I think that area has a good future ahead of it. It really comes down to that. It's the old, either we continue to apply chemotherapy or the tumors are going to grow back and they're going to be deadly. I think it's that simple. It really is that binary at the end of the day. There's just no way around it. It's the law of the land.
Well, fair enough. Fair enough. Was there another point you wanted to make before I move to the
Nope.
next topic?
Nope, that was
So,
it.
so then I want to talk about the hostages. We are expecting a third hostage release in this current phase to take place on Thursday. And Arbel Yehud, the civilian hostage, who was not released, though she was expected to have been released in the previous return of hostages, she is now going to be released, according to all sources, all reasonable sources, on Thursday, together with Agam Berger, who is one of the Tatzpitaniot, one of the surveillance soldiers that was kidnapped on October the 7th. And three more hostages will then be released on Shabbat. So you have the release of Agam Berger and Arbel Yehud on Thursday, and then three more hostages on Shabbat. In addition to that, there is a report by a member of the Bibas family that they were told quite a while ago at the end of the first release that took place. Can you remind me the date of the first round of hostage releases? If you don't have it to hand,
I think it was the 26th of November 23. Was you're talking about the first round of
yes,
releases?
the first
It was
round.
the end of November 2023.
So they were apparently told, the family was apparently informed that Shiri Bibas, the mother in the family, and the two children were not alive any longer, but they have not accepted that idea. They remain hopeful that they may yet be alive, despite having received, according to a family member, information provided to them by the Israel Defense Forces. In addition to, now I mentioned the Bibas family because this family is supposed to be returned during phase one of the hostage release deal. You also have the Lifshitz family. Oded Lifshitz is a very elderly individual, and his wife Yocheved Lifshitz both were kidnapped on October the 7th. Yocheved Lifshitz was released during that first round of releases. Oded remains in captivity, and we actually at the Miriam Institute brought their son, Itzhar Lifshitz, on last year's Israel Strategy and Policy Tour for members of the future officers of the U.S. Armed Forces, who we brought to visit the Nazi death camps in Poland. And because those delegates were not able to travel to Israel because of the security situation last year, we brought Israel and the story of Israel to them by embedding key individuals from Israel, individuals who had been tied up in the events of October the 7th and the events since, to be on the bus with them, to travel with them, and also to speak to them and provide a presentation to them. And so I know reasonably well, Itzhak Lifshitz, and Itzhak Lifshitz is also expressing that he is not confident that Oded, his father, who's well into his 80s, is going to be returned home alive. We know that 8 of the 33 hostages have been confirmed by way of a list presented from Hamas to Israel. 8 of those are no longer alive. The fear is that the Bibases are 3 of them. The fear is that Oded Lifshitz is another 1 of them. And we should be receiving these hostages, as I said, this Thursday and over Shabbat. What do you think about the state of the hostages being released? We've heard tremendous stories of courage. For example, Amit Susana, who was a hostage kidnapped into the Gaza Strip on October the 7th and was freed during the earlier hostage release. She actually said that one of the soldiers, the female soldiers who came back last week, Liri Albag, saved her life while she was in captivity, because Hamas was holding Amit Susana shackled for weeks at a time, threatening to kill her because they were asserting that she was a member of the Israel Defense Forces. And they brought Liri Albag. Think about this. Liri Albag must have been, in addition to what Amit Susana must have been undergoing, Liri Albag must have been of the mindset that if she didn't tell Hamas what they wanted to hear, Liri, may have been killed by them. But Liri actually insisted that Amit Susana was not an officer of the Israel Defense Forces, and she was so convincing in that testimony that they actually decided to stop torturing, or to reduce the degree of torture that they were meting out against Amit Susana. So I'm just wondering what you think about this terrible, terrible, awful, sinister lottery that Israelis continue to live through as they await word of the return of hostages and also the status of those hostages.
So this terrible lottery that you describe, I think, is the price that we're continuing to pay because of the fact that we were surprised so terribly by that catastrophic breakdown in our ability, in the IDF's ability to detect the threat, to build protection that was not reliant upon intelligence assessments, a whole host of failures, which, by the way, are going to come to light in a sharper way in the coming weeks, because the General Staff is going to complete 2 major after-action reviews. Defense Minister Israel Katz asked them to complete both of those reviews by the end of this month. That's not going to happen. The General Staff have said that they cannot meet that deadline, that they're still fighting in combat, and it takes time. So there's been that back and forth. But at the end of the day, we are still paying the price for that surprise, and that's why we have civilians and soldiers in Hamas's terrible, terrible possession, in which they're undergoing hell on earth. Now, the light in this tunnel, the light in this darkness, from my perspective, was when I saw the 4 young IDF female observation soldiers released last Saturday, and they were brought up on stage in what was supposed to be a Hamas propaganda show. And when you looked at these young women, and you see, after everything they've been through, and we don't know what they've been through, but after everything they've been through, they stood with their backs straight, and they emanated some sort of resilience and strength that still amazes me. I've been thinking about it since last Saturday, and I think that they kind of, without in any way diminishing the horrors that they've been through, and I think it's going to take them years to come back to routine and rehabilitation, psychological, hopefully nothing major physical, beyond the injuries that we know about. The strength that they broadcast from that Hamas stage, I think, energized the country. It energized the people of Israel, because they just projected unbelievable resilience, these 4 young women, and that continued after their release. And so I think that the quality of these people is beyond belief. That to have gone through something so unimaginable, and to be able to stand up on that stage and flash a smile that projected strength, and to spoil, in my view, Hamas's propaganda efforts, is something that I'm not going to forget quickly. And that's the light at the end of the tunnel. It's the quality of our people here. It's who we are as a people. And these 4 young women are incredible in my opinion, and my hope is that the whole country will learn from them. You know what I mean? That we learn something about resilience from these young women who have been through, the worst imaginable 15 months, and they walk away in that state. It's just a testament to what makes them up. What's their composition as human beings. So
Yeah,
I'm in awe of them. I really am. And my hope and my belief is that they sent sort of a wave of electricity into the people of Israel, saying, hold your heads up high. We're going to get through this as a nation, despite the obvious trauma and the scars that will be multi-generational, I think. But I think, it was a real sort of candlelight in the middle of a lot of darkness.
well, Yaakov, I'm sorry to be first of all, I agree with you. Tremendous show of resilience, tremendous show of strength. But according to and I don't believe that you find that resilience replicated anywhere else in the world, quite frankly. But according to the list that has been handed over, 8 of the hostages slated for release during this first release phase are not going to be upstanding. They're going to be coming back to us in coffins. There are 8 of them. And I think that as much as you've emphasized the light, I would implore our leaders to take a very, very clear-eyed view of the dark, blackened hearts of the people who perpetrated this against us, and recognize that they are responsible for bringing about some sort of resolution to this ongoing, pulsing threat emanating from Israel's southern, western flank. We have to do better than is currently the situation. And I actually want to return to the question that I asked you and you responded to in a qualified manner, a very sincere manner, but you qualified your answer. I wouldn't move to those areas, given the fact that the Gazans, to the southern communities of Israel, given the fact that the Gazans are moving back to being so proximate. And I think that while we can take inspiration from the strength demonstrated by the 4 soldiers, we must brace ourselves for the fact that that inspiration may not carry us through the disappointment, the terrible disappointment and the heartbreak that is definitely in our very near future, according to the constitution of this list, that 8 of these people are dead. And I remember very, very well, I went through this to some degree on a personal level, that the first war in which I served was the Second Lebanon War of 2006. It was a war that was precipitated by the kidnapping and killing of 2 reservists, Goldwasser and Regev, up in the northern area, up in the area of the Lebanese, Israel-Lebanon border. And we fought inside Lebanon, and we fought because they'd kidnapped our personnel. We fought because they'd kidnapped our soldiers. We fought because they'd kidnapped our civilians. And ultimately, I'm sure you remember, we all looked on as 2 coffins were nonchalantly unloaded from a Hezbollah truck in accordance with the terms of the ceasefire, within which were the remains of Goldwasser and Regev. There is nothing that really twists the heart and twists one's insides quite to the degree of seeing that. And I was completely unrelated to those 2 individuals. Imagine what the family members are going to go through when this happens now with these 8 hostages that we're expecting to come home. So great resilience, but a lot of tragedy and heartache up ahead, and it can never, ever be allowed to. Again, you made reference to it being multi-generational. The last multi-generational trauma that befell the Jewish people was, of course, I would say, the Holocaust. And the Holocaust has been accompanied in its remembrance by the phrase "never again." Israel's leaders are going to have to ensure that such a dynamic will never again take place. So I will move on to 2 last points, one of which you alluded to. The first is at the conclusion of the investigations undertaken by the Israel Defense Forces, Herzi Halevi, the current Chief of the General Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, for the Americans, Chief of Staff, if you don't know, does not mean that it's not the same role as the Chief of Staff of the White House. This is the chief commander, if you like, of the entire military of Israel. He has announced that he will be stepping down. along with Doron Finkelman, who is the commander of the Southern Brigade. He is going to be stepping down, although Finkelman didn't say when. Herzi Halevi did give a date. He said that he'll be stepping down, I believe, on March the 6th, which is the same date as the investigation is expected to be concluded, something that he felt he needed to stay in position in order to oversee. And I don't want to talk really too much about Herzi Halevi. Maybe we can do that closer to the time of his departure, which, by the way, I don't think can come swiftly enough. But there are three individuals who are being considered to replace him. One of them is Amir Baram. He's the deputy chief of staff who recently resigned. He was said to be at odds for a long time with Herzi Halevi, did not see eye to eye with Herzi Halevi on how the war inside Gaza was being prosecuted. There's also Tamir Yadai, and finally there is Eyal Zamir. Eyal Zamir is the most interesting candidate of the three to me, and I wanted to get just very briefly your insights on the viability of the candidacy of Eyal Zamir. Tell us a little bit about who he is, where he's currently serving. He's in an interesting spot that I believe adds a certain advantage to his nomination, a certain strength to his potential nomination, and what his mindset is, in your opinion, and whether or not Eyal Zamir, who most Israelis are viewing as the favorite to become the next chief commander of the Israel Defense Forces, whether or not Eyal Zamir, who grew up in the same military machine as did Herzi Halevi, will bring a different doctrine, mindset, and outlook to the operation and the command of the Israel Defense Forces, as is so desperately needed in post-October 7th reality.
Yeah, I'll just start by saying that I think all of them are the highly experienced and professional commanders and major generals. Look, Eyal Zamir, who's currently the Director General of the Defense Ministry, and he's really embarked on a very ambitious domestic weapons production program in order to wean as much as possible Israel off of dependence on American weapons supply to the extent that this is possible. And obviously it's not 100% possible. There are certain things that we cannot or not going to produce here, but as much as possible, he has really pushed. And as a result of this push, the Defense Ministry has signed billions worth of agreements and contracts with Israeli defense companies, large ones and smaller ones, and we're seeing production lines spring into action for air-to-ground missiles, for surface-to-surface projectors, a whole range of tank shells, and fighter jet bombs, all the things that, Israel has been so worried that, maybe the Biden administration will wake up and decide that it didn't like the last operation. And we know that President Trump, by the way, just released the 2,000 kilogram bombs. I think they're called MK-84s, as well as armored bulldozers. So, okay, so we have a good relationship with the current administration. You yourself said we can't count on that. And it's because of that fickleness that Eyal Zamir has pushed through, in line with the cabinet decision, by the way, to create as much independence and oxygen. I would call this basically an oxygen supply, because in war, you are measured by the supply of ammunition and weapons that you have going in. That's your oxygen supply. And when those run out, you can no longer breathe. You can't fight. And the whole world is finding that out. Ukraine and Russia, wars are long now. There's no such thing as a short war. That era is long gone. So Eyal Zamir has been instrumental in pushing that. Now, look, I remember him before that as Southern Command, long before this. Between 2015 and 2018, he was the commander of Southern Command, which is responsible for preparing for war with Hamas. And I happen to know from that time that Eyal Zamir was a major general who thought very seriously about the potential need to replace Hamas, because he was very aware that Hamas's ideology was to replace us, that it could either ultimately be us or Hamas. And, I think he was suspicious for a long time about this idea that we could coexist with Hamas. He was definitely, I would not put him in the conceptia, which is, the Hebrew for the misconception. That's the best translation, by the way, I can find for that word. Deeply held concept that turns out to be wildly inaccurate. I don't think he was ever part of that. So from my perspective, I think he would be an excellent choice, but that's not to detract from the other two. Baram sent a letter, public letter, criticizing the way this war is being handled by his superior, which is something that's almost never done. So that tells you about the strength of his feelings. And he alluded to the waning intensity, which, if you read a little bit between the lines, he's saying that this can't be. We can't have waning intensity. He wants higher intensity, not waning intensity. That's a severe criticism that he appears to have leveled at his only superior commander, which is Herzl Levy. And listen, Tamir Yada is a very, very competent and professional commander. He is the outgoing commander of the ground forces, and he was in the unenviable position of having to train ground forces. That's what the commander of the ground forces does. He doesn't actually command them in operations in the IDF. That's done by the divisions, by the territorial divisions, by the commands, etc. But the commander of the ground division is in charge of training. But now he's been, find himself at war for the past year and a half. So he has had to balance the force buildup with the activation of force all at the same time for basically an unprecedented time period. The last time I think that the IDF has fought this long, this consistently, is the 1948 War of Independence, and Tamir Yada has met that balance, I think, in a very admirable way. So I guess that would be a rough overview of those three, and we'll have the decision, I think, within probably a month or so. We'll hear from Israel Katz, the defense minister, about what he's decided. Most people are putting their money on Eyal Zamir, but I don't know. I really don't know what Katz is going to choose. I think Zamir is the most likely option, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, incidentally, I think Katz is doing a pretty decent job as defense minister at the moment. He made a statement just today from the Golan Heights expressing that the IDF has absolutely no intention whatsoever of withdrawing from the areas that it moved into following the collapse of the Assad regime. He actually said it with conviction. I found myself believing him as I listened to his words. I don't think that he's done a bad job to this point, and I think that he's right to have said that he was going to hold up any promotions within the Israel Defense Forces under the current leadership. He was not willing to see the axiomatic automatic promotion of officers to their next rank under the current leadership of the Israel Defense Forces. At the very least, he was going to dip his nose and take a very good look at what was going on under the hood there, which I think is an admirable step. He has had his initial interviews with all three of these candidates. There's a possibility there's going to be a fourth candidate put forward. I'm not going to say the name, but there are rumors about it. And one thing that may fall onto Katz's plate is the final point that I want us to discuss. I'd like us to discuss it just very briefly, Yaakov, because I know we're both a little bit short on time. We had today a remarkable threat from Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, another individual unctuous with his turn of phrase. And he has actually threatened that regional disaster will be meted out if Iran's nuclear facilities are hit. He actually said that in English, and he went on to say that he's open to negotiation for a new deal with the Trump administration, but the trust that he has in the various brokers of any such deal is diminished based on what he says is their previous experience. He's referring, of course, to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran deal. But this idea that this paper tiger actually has the audacity to threaten regional disaster if the tools of causing even greater regional disaster, namely their nuclear weapons program, if that is in any way attacked, the audacity of the man is beyond description. My only hope is that now that we have defanged Hezbollah to a great extent, now that the skies are far more open than they were with the departure of the Assad regime and the departure from the Russians and the Russian air defense systems from inside Syria as once they were prior to the collapse of that regime, I really do hope that we will not be deterred by such nonsense, particularly when we measure up that rhetorical bluster of this individual against the impact and the actual outcome and results that the Iranian regime was able to bring about. including, but not limited to, when they launched their 2 ballistic missile attacks against sovereign Israel.
Yeah, 100%. Look, I agree. I'll tell you, my concern here is that Trump is going to try and apply his art of the deal to the Iranians. And I really hope that he doesn't try to do that. I'm sorry, Ben, you're on mute. I know you've just said something.
No, I'm not on mute. I'm
Oh,
not
sorry.
on.
I heard you
Oh,
speaking.
it's
I
saying the
saw you
internet's
speaking.
unstable. I apologize, but I just I was so compelled by what you said, Yaakov. I just had to be rude and interrupt you. I share the exact same concern. But
Right.
please continue.
Right. So, because obviously the art of the deal cannot be applied to the jihadist Shiite Iranian regime, its Ayatollahs and the IRGC. But what the Iranians know very well to do is to use carrot and stick to fool the West, to fool the United States, to buy itself time, to wait out the administration if it's particularly problematic for them. And then they go right back and inching forward to break out. Right now, by the way, they're about a week from being able to enrich uranium to the degree that they have enough for a first nuclear weapon. That doesn't mean that they're a week away from a nuclear weapon. I always make that distinction because they still have to put together a warhead and do a bunch of other things. But they're very close. They're disturbingly close. They're clearly in the threshold zone. And the nuclear program is the only thing they have left. They don't really have much of their proxy network left. Their missile program is not what it used to be. As you use the word defanged, I like that word. Their air defenses have largely been destroyed. They're very vulnerable. So, look, I think that the only solution is to strike their nuclear program and to do it soon. This is the time. When your enemy is down and your enemy, if he gets back up, he's going to come for you. This is street logic. You have got to finish the job. Otherwise, you're letting him recover. So, I think that this is the time to strike their nuclear program. But if Trump goes for a maximum pressure campaign, I think that would actually be negative because what's the point of a maximum pressure campaign? It's to push them into negotiations. And then we're going to get into this lengthy thing, and the Iranians are going to start with their whole deception, which they're so good at. So I hope that doesn't happen. And if it does happen, I hope that Israel reserves its right to act because at the end of the day, I think this is the time. This is the time for that ammunition to start dropping on Natanz and Fordo. I think this is the right time, and I hope that that's what's going to happen because I think that's the only thing that's going to push that program back by at least a couple of years, at least 2 to 3 years, until we see what happens with that regime.
Well, Yaakov, in fairness to President Trump, I saw him on a recent media interview, in which he alluded to the idea that he was able to bring about an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine in a very short period of time, and that is his plan to do so. But he went on to express that Iran is very different, very, very different, and he went on to describe it as a religious issue. It's a religiously motivated issue. It's not the same in his mind, in his calculus, as he expressed, as Ukraine. It's not the same as Russia. So there does seem to be that element to his understanding, although he's very much an individual who has expressed that he's motivated by ending wars, not bringing about wars. Incidentally, I don't think that anybody needs to fear a war. I don't think there would be a war that would eventuate from the detonation of Iran's nuclear weapons program. I think that the opposite would occur. And I think that that's what our experience teaches us, right? Our experience teaches us that when you take out these nuclear weapons programs, as we did in Syria in 2007, as we did in Iraq in 1981, those regimes ultimately crumble. It might take some time, but they ultimately crumble. Whereas if you leave them to procure or to build nuclear weapons, those regimes endure, as we've learned, for example, from North Korea. And I would even say, as we've seen in Russia to some extent, although it's a very different dynamic. And also we have to consider who President Trump has around him. When I think about Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, has been very, very outspoken about the nuclear weapons program of Iran and the need to counter it and frankly to rid the earth of that. When I think about Waltz, National Security Advisor, even when I think incidentally about Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to the States of Israel, these are individuals who've been very, very forthright. And indeed, Pete Hegseth, who can forget the recently confirmed Secretary of Defense, He's been very outspoken about it. So we'll wait and see. But I will just conclude that chapter of this conversation, Yaakov, by saying I hope that we will not be deterred by the bluster and the language of this foreign minister or anybody else speaking on behalf of Iran. And also, I will tell you that I very much hope that if there is a decision to tackle that kinetically, that it is Israel that tackles it. I believe we can do it. I've been told by every expert with whom I've spoken that we have the capabilities to do so. And I don't think that we should be waiting for a green light, blue light, fluorescent, flashing light from anybody, including the United States. The threat is there. The threat is building. And we know, unfortunately, I believe we know more profoundly than ever before, that if we are to rid the threats from before us, it is we who have to go forward in order to counter them directly and not wait for anybody else. So, Yaakov, unless you've got something to add to that.
Just one sentence. We cannot
Please.
let this regime, this fundamentalist Shiite regime that wants to rebuild its empire, we cannot allow it to drink the potion of immortality, and that is nuclear weapons. At any cost, that cannot happen. Restraint, as somebody wrote, funnily enough, on LinkedIn, in this case and in many other cases, restraint is escalation and not the other way around, as you've been saying.
I like that. I agree with you. Thank you, as always, for being with me here, and I look forward to the next time. Take care, Yaakov. And to all the listeners, please make sure you subscribe and leave a rating and review. And finally, we will be hosting John Spencer, the chair of Urban Warfare Studies at West Point, at a live event. He'll be briefing about what's taken place inside the Gaza Strip from his perspective as a consequence of his research, having done embeds inside Gaza during this war at least 5 times. He'll be speaking in New York City on February the 11th, Tuesday, February the 11th at 6 p.m. I'll leave a link in the show notes where you can sign up if you wish to attend. I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.